Hi guys, this is Mr. Sherping. For those of you who don't recognize me, I am the student teacher over with Mrs. Ness Deeden this year for this trimester, and I'm also the one who took over for Mrs. Noel since she went on a leave this trimester. So if you guys have never seen my face, here it is. And you're going to be stuck seeing it for the rest of this video here. So today we are going to be going a little bit more into bacteria. So in this unit, we started introducing bacteria yesterday, and today we're going to go a little bit more in depth about what they are and how they grow and stuff like that. So starting off, bacteria are living. They are living things, so they need to follow and abide by our 8 characteristics of life here. So we'll go over a couple of these characteristics here. So first of all, we have bacterial growth. So bacteria, they grow, they're living, they need to grow. So in order to grow, they need some favorable conditions. Depending on what strain of bacteria, that could be different. But in the grand scheme of things, each type needs a certain food source. It needs enough space to grow. If there's no space, enough resources, it won't be able to grow. And they also need some sort of moisture. They also need water just like we do in order to grow. So they need that access to moisture as well. So one thing that's really intriguing about bacteria is that they can live pretty much almost anywhere. And I mean like anywhere. They can live in pretty much any environment that you can think of. They can live without oxygen. Some can live in extreme temperatures, like near volcanoes, up in the Arctic. Anywhere you can think on Earth, there's probably going to be bacteria. I know in the picture right here, this is like a thermal vent at the bottom of the ocean spitting out carbon dioxide from the magma underneath the crust. So these are extremely hot. There's not a lot of oxygen, and yet bacteria are still able to live and thrive. So another thing, bacteria, they can live alone, so they can be just like lone wolves. They can live alone, living, fending for themselves, or they can be in groups, live in colonies. This is generally what we see and what we'll be looking at later in this unit. They tend to live in colonies, in groups, or they can also live inside of other organisms. So right now, we as people have bacteria inside us that help us do things such as digest food and a bunch of other bodily processes. So they need that specific environment in order to live. And thank God, because we wouldn't be able to properly function without them. So next, they also evolve. So bacteria, they change over time. So how this happens, one way that happens is what we call conjugation here. So that's a big keyword here, and that's basically exchanging their genetic information. So in our picture here, you can see we have one bacteria here and another one right here. And we kind of have this weird purplish line coming in between them. So that is like a little tube that connects each other, and then they share their genetic information through that tube to create some genetic diversity. And that genetic diversity causes them to change species and change their DNA. So this is increasing the genetic diversity. More genetic diversity is definitely a good thing, because if there's genes for one bacteria and all of a sudden they're bad genes for a certain environment now, they're all going to die. But if there's the genetic diversity, there might be some genes to some bacteria that may be able to survive, and then they can keep reducing because they have those couple individuals that was able to adapt and survive. So here's just what I said. The bacteria with the helpful DNA survive and reproduce more, which means they pass their genes on more, which means their species overall evolves in the long run here. So you also know that living things reproduce. So bacteria can reproduce asexually in a phenomenon that we call binary fission. So here in binary fission is when a bacteria cell, it copies its own DNA. So it has 2 copies of its DNA inside of it, and then it divides in half, and each one of those halves gets its own copy here. So see, you can start with one cell with this green little noodle looking thing. That's going to be our DNA. And then you can see we have a purple and a red. It might be a little hard to see, but there's 2 copies there. And then each side gets the pinkish reddish, the other one gets the purple, and then they kind of cut off here and create two new bacteria cells. These are basically identical. So these are the same bacteria cells. They are clones of one another because they have the exact same DNA. So, talking about reproduction, how fast can some bacteria reproduce? Does it take hours? Does it take days? Well, that depends on the strand, and it depends on the environment they're in. If they have enough food, if they have enough space, and they have enough moisture, they can reproduce very, very quickly. So, in the best case scenario for our bacteria, when the conditions are favorable, bacteria can divide as often like every 20 minutes. So, okay, if you have one, 20 minutes later, you have two, that might not seem like a big idea. If you keep going over time, each one of those bacteria that you get is going to reproduce. So it's going to start reproducing and numbers are going to get exponentially higher. So as you can see in this graph here, it starts off really slow. They don't really up in numbers very much, but as time goes on and each new bacteria cell is added to reproduce again, it starts adding up over a while and it can get out of control very quickly as long as there's enough space, moisture, and food to go around for all the population. Otherwise, you'll hit that carrying capacity cap. So, bacteria also need energy, another characteristic of life. So, different types of bacteria can get energy in different ways here. So, bacteria can be either autotrophs, if you remember, those are organisms that can make their own food, or they can be heterotrophs, which means they need to consume other organisms in order to get their energy. So, we've talked about photosynthesis a lot. Some bacteria actually have chloroplasts that can undergo photosynthesis and make their own food. So, they can make their own glucose and then they can do cellular respiration from there to create their own energy. But if they're heterotrophs, they need to eat other organisms or get their energy from a different source. So this is where they would get their energy, and then use that consume food for their own cellular respiration. So here they can perform either aerobic or anaerobic respiration. So remember, aerobic means with oxygen, and anaerobic here means without oxygen. So if they do anaerobic, this is the type of fermentation we usually like to do to get food or alcohol. So bacteria are one form of where we can get food, like cheese and yogurt are a really good example of how using anaerobic respiration can be really helpful and beneficial to us. So talking about being beneficial, why are bacteria important? Why are we even talking about them? They're so small and insignificant, right? Wrong. So obviously the bad thing, they can cause food to go bad. When food spoils, when like you open up that milk and you smell it and it smells awful, that's because bacteria got into it and caused it to go bad. Also, obviously they can cause disease. They can damage cells or release toxins that are obviously poisonous to other living things and cause really bad disease. So if you think of like strep throat, if you've heard of a staph infection, those are all diseases caused by bacteria. Also, if there you go, strep throat, Lyme disease, tetanus are all caused by bacteria, and they're also caused tooth decay. That's one of the reasons why we brush our teeth, to get rid of that bacteria that will eat our teeth away. So that's a lot of bad stuff, but we also need bacteria in order to operate and just live in society. So they're really good at decomposing. They're one of our decomposers. So they can break things down in our soil, help the carbon get back into our carbon cycle, for example. And they can help us break down things like our sewage. So in our waste treatment water plants, there's a lot of bacteria in there that we're using for good and breaking down sewage. So next is going to be our nitrogen fixers. If you remember, in our nitrogen cycle, nitrogen can't just go from one form to the next. It needs the help of bacteria in order to go from things like ammonia to nitrate to nitrite. So we need those bacteria to help the nitrogen cycle go around. If you remember our fishbowl example, the nitrogen levels got too high because we didn't have any more bacteria, and that became toxic to our organisms and caused them to die. So we need we need bacteria for our nitrogen cycles. And they're also helpful for, I mentioned this already, but they're also helpful for creating foods like yogurt and cheese. So yogurt and cheese needs to sit over time and allow bacteria to work in order to get them to how we know them and how we eat them. If you guys have never made yogurt with your own bacteria, it's actually pretty good. So if you ever have the opportunity to do that, don't be scared. Say yes. Bacteria aren't always bad. They're using a good type of bacteria. So don't be worried about that. I definitely recommend trying it. And then industry. So they're helpful for a lot of different industries. In this case, we're talking about oil spill cleanups. So oil is really hard to clean, but with the help of bacteria, it makes it a lot easier to get rid of that pollution. And finally, probably one of the most important parts is that are in our bodies. There's a symbiotic relationship there where we're both working together. Our bodies give them a place to live, and in return, they help us like fight off maybe some other bacteria that could be considered bad. They can fight for space, and hopefully they'll win. They can also help break down food and a bunch of other stuff that's just way too many to list and go over in this video. But just know they're in your body, and we want them to be there. So don't be scared of them. Bacteria can be very good and they can also be very bad. So it's not so black and white where the bacteria is just bad and that's it. Welcome them in sometime. And it's really important that you get to know them. So if you have any questions, please let any of us know. And I will see you guys in class here.